I just watched Jesus Revolution a couple months ago, and I remember one of the lines in there is God has a long history of using broken people, and that's true.
Hey friends, welcome to another installment of Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda. It's a short podcast and YouTube installment where me and a speaker who basically engages with people all the time on apologetics and evangelism issues talk about times when we coulda, shoulda, or woulda done it differently or better or learned from our mistakes. Well, with me on the show today is Janell Wood. Janell Wood is a friend that I encountered by being asked to be on her podcast. By the way, a podcast every single one of you should be watching or listening to on Apple Podcasts and other places you can get your podcasts as well. She's on Instagram. The podcast is called Finding Something Real, REAL. That's an acronym for something, by the way. I'm going to let Janell at the end of the video tell you what that's all about, because the podcast is incredibly unique. I got to brag about her just for a little bit before I let her share her story. And that is this. This is innovative. This is one of the most meaningful podcasts I've ever been on. And here's why. She and her husband have foreign exchange students who live with them, and she asked them if they're okay with it to be on a podcast with a speaker or someone who can share the credibility of the Christian faith and have their deepest and most pressing questions answered right then and there, and engage, and they can talk back to the not talk back in terms of a sassy way, because they're all respectful, but they can respond. Maybe a little, and that's okay. It's a real conversation. So if you want to find something real in terms of an actual real conversation between a Christian and a non-Christian on matters of faith, listen to her podcast, Finding Something Real. There's a double entendre there because real is an acronym. So I highly recommend it. Go to not Janell M. Wood. You could go to janellmwood.com, but what I would ask you to do is actually go to findingsomethingreal.com, and you'll see her blogs, her podcasts. You can request her as a speaker as well. So with all that being said, Janell, welcome to the show.
Abdu Murray, thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for allowing me to share about the podcast and share about mistakes I've made, because I've made a few. So thank you for what you're doing. I love the premise of this.
You bet. Oh, well, you know what? And everybody's been on the show has been said, I'm so glad I get to do this. And you don't think of people being glad about sharing their mistakes, but everybody learns from them. I've learned more from my failures and from the failures of others than I have from the successes, although those are valuable too. So let's hear it. Let's hear a story, some kind of an insight you have about a time when you could have, should have, or would have done it differently.
Yeah, there would be no podcast if there weren't girls that we love that have come into our lives. And a few years ago, I'll just jump into this story because it was the first one that came to my mind when you asked. A few years ago, we had a young woman visit us from Europe. She was with us for a couple of weeks. She loved on our kids. I have 4 kids. And so, it was just this delight. And we had hosted a sibling of hers. So we knew her kind of, but not really that well. And I got it in my mind, like, I am going to share the Lord with her. She comes from a country that's very secular. I know her family really well. I'm on a mission. Now, I won't give a lot of commentary on it, but I was very driven and intentional and strategic in some of the ways that I, dealt with our interactions. And some of them were really beautiful. We had some great conversations about the gospel. I even, got out, shared Jesus without fear, and was going through questions with her. And we watched this movie, Lee Strobel's story, A Case for Christ, which I love watching with young women that I love. And it was just really beautiful. And then it got to a point where maybe it wasn't as beautiful, because after she decided she wasn't ready to accept Christ, I took her to this event for young women. It was just a weekly thing where we got together. And I must have been in charge of the content that day. I don't remember. But we watched a video that I know I wanted to watch, which was Francis Chan's 15-minute video, Stop and Think, which is an evangelistic tool. And afterwards, when we were driving home, it was about a 20-minute drive. It became very tense, Abdu. It was like all of these things started coming to the surface in our conversation. She, I think, felt a little pushed, which, looking back, I can understand that. And she she started talking about, why does God get to choose? Why does he get to decide morality? She got to a point, and we were just going back and forth, to the point where it was tense, and it was still perhaps loving, but in retrospect, it got a little heated. And so the next day, I took her to the airport. It was about between 3 to 4 hours of travel, and she was going home. And that morning, I remember just feeling so anxious, like, what if this is the only time that she gets to hear how much Jesus loves her, and she's choosing to reject him? And I remember praying with my husband. My heart, I thought, was in the right place. We get into the car, and you could probably cut the tension with the knife a little bit. And she wanted to be quiet. And I just said, hey, can I turn on an audiobook to listen to? And we listened to, what book was it? Nabil Qureshi's Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, for 3.5 hours. Pretty sure she was rolling her eyes the entire time. And that's how we ended the time together. In retrospect, my master's degree is in counseling psychology, and psychologists know this as well as what you read in the Bible. There is no fear in love, right? And the truth of the matter is, a lot of times we're motivated by one thing or the other. We're motivated by love, or we're motivated by fear. And for me, it got to a point where it was no longer motivated by love. It was motivated by fear. What if she doesn't hear this? What if this is her last chance? And fear feels like control, right? Love feels like surrender. And looking back, oh man, that was a rough time.
Can I pause you for a moment there? Because what you just said, we have to make sure people dwell on for a moment. Fear feels like control. Love feels like surrender. That's what I'm. Okay, that's a good enough time to marinate. That was great. I got to say, Janell, honestly, that was so good. When you become afraid, there's this need. I certainly feel this. I can tell you scores of times when I've been in conversations where I know at some point there's a confirmation where it's tell them the gospel right now, don't wait. And I don't feel any sense of fear about it. I might feel anxious because I need to do it right and I want to do it well and I care about this person, but it's not fear. And so you just spoke to a super important distinction, is that if you're anxious because you love the person, and I'm sure you loved her anyway, but that's something we have to really dwell on, is that control aspect of it.
And the truth is, we're broken people. And I think we're always going to be motivated by a mixture of both, right? None of us are perfect. Thank God that he uses broken people. I just watched Jesus Revolution a couple months ago, and I remember one of the lines in there is, God has a long history of using broken people. And that's true. And so I think there's always going to be a little bit of both, but coming to the Lord and just saying, God, help me to hear your voice in this situation right now. Help me to love you and love this person next to me, and to recognize that God is bigger than that. He's bigger than our attempts to wait a second, if it's not me, who else is it going to be? No, he can use anybody. If he can use a donkey, he can use me, right? And then he can choose somebody else. And it doesn't fall on me. The onus doesn't fall on me. It's just to be obedient, like you said. And sometimes that means speaking out and going, okay, I'm going to do this regardless of how this person responds. And sometimes it means, just saying, hey, are we okay? Let's talk about the weather, whatever it is, and continuing to show that person you care about them, that they're not a project, but somebody to love. Yeah.
So let me go back in time. Let's use the time machine here for a second and say, okay, now that if you had the ability to sit in that car with her again, what would you have done differently?
I probably would have just let there be that awkward silence for a little bit. And I probably would have had a conversation with her about the night before and just said, hey, are we okay? And maybe I probably still would have turned on worship music, to be honest. I was telling my husband, I said, how much would I have done different? In the moment, I thought that it was all right. And looking back, I think that it was a little too much because, like I said, it was really motivated by fear. And when you're coming to the Lord and you're like, Lord, and it's this desperate plea of I just want to get a hold of this girl, he loves that person more than I do, so much more. And he can, like I said, he can use anybody. It doesn't fall. It's not the Janell Wood show or the Abdu show, right? He uses the church. And so sometimes we just need to let go and say, okay, God, I've been obedient. I've walked with you. And now I'm going to release this to you. Because we can sow the seeds, but we don't get to see, control the harvest. We don't get to control what happens after that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that that's an important thing for people to hear, because sometimes they might think, okay, my goodness, well, what if I have this like an anxious concern for someone, or should I do it or should I not do it? Clearly, you're not saying don't share the gospel in the moment where you might feel a little on the anxious side. Go ahead and do it, but that motivated by fear versus motivated by love. Boy, if there is a title, and maybe we'll make it the title of this episode, that has to be there. It's pray for the wisdom to make the distinction between when you're motivated by fear and motivated by love. Because we can be motivated by fear to be silent, or motivated by fear to say something. But love helps us to make the distinctions and to move wisely.
Well,
Go
I was
ahead.
just
Yeah,
going to
please.
say too, when I was invited to be on this podcast, I thought of how gracious
Mhm.
God is, because despite our failings, because I've messed up, that's just one example, right? I mean, there's a whole plethora of them. God is
Oh, yeah, me too.
God is so gracious, because there's no
Mm,
shame in all that. You know what I
mm,
mean? I don't
yeah.
feel shame and
Mhm.
guilt over that whole situation. I'm sad that I didn't respond differently. But when we walk in faith and we go, okay, God, I'm praying, I'm giving this to you. I want to walk in obedience, even when we feel later like, oh, I kind of screwed up. God is faithful, and he uses even our mess ups
Mhm.
and the things that anything we've surrendered to him, he can use. And so I just am really
Mm,
grateful, because I wouldn't have the podcast that I have today were it not for all the mistakes that I've made. And just like you said,
mhm,
continuing to go, okay, Lord, I want to walk in love with you. I don't want to be silent. And I don't want to be, so afraid that I'm going to do the wrong thing that I don't move forward in this. Um, and he's so good to us.
yeah,
He's so good. So
yeah. Yeah, indeed. Well, thanks for the vulnerability and for being real. And that's my ham-handed segue into having you explain what you mean by finding something real with regard to your podcast and your
yeah.
ministry.
Well, I invite young women to join me on the podcast. Often they are young women from different countries, but sometimes they are young women from, the U.S. and young women with questions or concerns about the Christian faith. A lot of times they're not believers. Sometimes they are. Um, Sometimes their version of Christianity is a little different. And I invite them to come on. And just share their story. So the first episode of the month is just that young woman and I having a conversation where she shares her faith journey and also her questions. And then throughout the month, we invite Christian guests like yourself and other people who can, uh, answer that young woman in love and truth. And so REAL is an acronym for restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love. Those are all things that as a Christian, I believe we ultimately find in relationship with Jesus Christ. But I invite young women on a journey to discover that if they choose to with me. And it's been a really beautiful thing. I've been podcasting now for 3.5 years, and like I said, God has been so gracious to me, because I've made a lot of mistakes there too. But uh, he's faithful. So I'm really, really grateful to get to do the work that I do.
Well, I'm grateful you get to do the work you do as well. I'm grateful to have been on your podcast. By the way, other people who our audience may know, and there's plenty of people you don't know who've been on, and you should get to know. But yeah, my friend Andy Bannister, Justin Brierly from Unbelievable was on the podcast as well. Lindsay Mandewalt, and a host of other people as well. John Noyes, Frank Turek, a lot of folks who do apologetics, evangelism all the time are engaging in it. Friends, this is a podcast worth your watch or worth your listen, because evangelism is not only taught, it's also caught. And if you're watching someone literally do it, right then and there, whether it's Janell talking with the young lady herself or with a guest on. You will be benefited by finding something real. Go to findingsomethingreal.com to see the episodes, to see Janell's blog, and you can invite her as a speaker as well, which I recommend you do. And of course, she's on Instagram. The Instagram handle is?
Yeah, it's Janell_M_Wood, which is complicated. Just search Finding Something Real and you'll find me.
There you go. There you go, friends. Well, Janell, it's been a real pleasure to have you on. Friends, this has been Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda. Don't forget, if you're not already subscribing to the YouTube channel, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure you click the bell so you're notified whenever Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda or our other podcasts, All Rise and Deliberations, either have new episodes or go live, because we do go live with Deliberations. But you won't know unless you click the bell and you subscribe to this channel. And please do share it with your friends. Not only would you share the content of Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda and Embrace the Truth, but you'll share the content of wonderful apologists and speakers like Janell as well. So, Janell, it's been a true honor and a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I'm looking forward to us catching up again
I'm
soon.
excited to have you back on the podcast in a couple months here, Abdu. Thank you so much for coming back on. And thank you for this.
My pleasure. It was great to have you on. All right, friends, that's been Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda. We'll see you next time.